On March 27, 1977, flight number 4805 of KLM took off from Amsterdam Airport heading to the Canary Islands. The aircraft was piloted by 3 crew members, Captain Jacob Van Zanten, first officer, and flight engineer Willem Schrader. On board, there were 235 passengers and 14 crew members. They were supposed to land at Gran Canaria Airport in the Canary Islands, but they received reports of a potential terrorist attack there. Therefore, they redirected their flight to Los Rodeos Airport in the Canary Islands. The Gran Canaria Airport was completely closed because they wanted to determine whether there was indeed a terrorist threat. As a result, many aircraft were sent to Los Rodeos Airport, which was relatively small and did not have the capacity to accommodate so many planes. On the other hand, a flight had also come from New York to the Canary Islands, which was supposed to land at Gran Canaria Airport, but since that airport was closed, it was redirected here. This flight was number 1736 of Pan American Airlines. The pilot of this flight was Captain Victor Grubbs, with First Officer Robert Burke and Flight Engineer George Wall. The aircraft had 13 crew members and was fully booked with 380 passengers. You should know that both of these aircraft were Boeing 747 Cessnas, which was the largest aircraft in the world at that time. Both planes landed at the airport and waited for the main airport to reopen so that their passengers could disembark on the island. After a few hours, Gran Canaria Airport reopened, and the KLM 747 began refueling. The Pan American flight was ready for takeoff, but it couldn't depart because the KLM was at the beginning of the runway, refueling. Since the airport was small, there was no space for both planes. Therefore, Pan American waited for KLM to finish refueling. KLM completed its refueling and was instructed to taxi to the end of the runway, turn around, and take off in the opposite direction. The Pan American aircraft was also at the beginning of the runway, preparing to turn around and face the opposite direction, ready for takeoff. Let me tell you a bit about this airport. This island in the Canary Islands is relatively elevated, with the airport situated 600 meters above sea level. Because of this, the weather was foggy, and the pilots could barely see 100 meters ahead. While KLM was standing by, ready for takeoff, Pan American was instructed to proceed on the runway and exit at number 3. Then turn around and come behind KLM. Pan American began taxiing down the runway to reach exit number 3. The fog was so thick that the pilot could not see where he was going or find the exits. He was just moving forward trying to spot the exit. When Pan American passed exit number 3, it came face to face with KLM, but neither plane could see the other. The airport was so small and lacked the necessary equipment that there was no radar to detect that 2 aircraft were facing each other on the runway. They were relying on the pilot's reports, and they themselves did not understand what was happening on the runway. At that moment, the first officer of KLM contacted the control tower and asked if they could take off yet. The control tower's response to KLM made it seem like they could take off, but what they meant was to wait. After this, the KLM pilot informed the control tower that they were ready for takeoff, but the tower's response was unclear, leading the pilot to think he could proceed. KLM began to roll down the runway. Meanwhile, the Pan American pilot contacted the control tower, saying he was on the runway and could not find anything. The control tower was so overwhelmed that they did not respond to the Pan American pilot. They didn't even say prepare for impact as a giant aircraft was coming. Pan American was searching for an exit and looking around when suddenly he spotted the shadow of a 747 coming towards him. He panicked, pushed the throttle to the maximum, and swerved left to exit the runway. However, KLM was increasing its speed to take off. Captain Van Zanten finally saw Pan American, so he tried to climb to avoid hitting it, but he didn't have enough speed to lift off because he had turned left. The nose of KLM had left the runway, but its fuselage was still on the runway, and as KLM's nose rose, its wings struck the fuselage of Pan American. The wheels of KLM tore off upon impact with Pan American, and KLM, having jumped off the ground, went into the air. However, the aircraft was damaged and could not stay airborne, so it came down and crashed. The KLM's fuel tanks were full because it had just refueled. When it hit the ground, it skidded for 150 meters and the sparks ignited the fuel, causing a massive fire. All 248 passengers and crew on board KLM were burned alive. On the other hand, the Pan American aircraft had a total of 396 people on board. Inside the burning aircraft, flames were not as large as KLM's, but half of the plane was on fire. As a result, 61 people seated on the left side of the Pan American aircraft managed to escape and survive. This massive accident, which became known as the largest aviation disaster, occurred on the runway, but the control tower was asleep and did not realize that such an event had taken place until another aircraft passing by contacted the tower and reported that a 747 had exploded. They then realized what had happened, but still didn't fully understand. They thought only KLM had exploded because Pan American was 300 meters away. They sent fire and rescue vehicles to KLM, unaware that another aircraft had also crashed on the other side. After a while, they learned that another aircraft had also crashed, but they did not have the necessary equipment to provide effective assistance. 3 countries and 2 major airlines began investigations into why this happened, and none of them accepted responsibility for the other. Each conducted separate investigations. After the investigations, it was revealed that the KLM pilot and first officer had used incorrect phrases over the radio, leading the control tower to misunderstand their intentions. On the other hand, the control tower was also at fault because they did not pay attention to Pan American's messages, as the Pan American pilot reported more than 3 times that he could not find the exit and was still on the runway, but they did not respond. Another major mistake by the control tower was instructing the Pan American 747 to go to exit 3, which was meant for smaller aircraft and was not suitable for a 747. In any case, the control tower and the KLM pilots were found to be at fault because these 2 groups did not communicate properly and were careless in their dialogue, leading to the disaster. The KLM pilots perished, but the control tower personnel survived and could not forgive themselves for their negligence that resulted in the deaths of 583 people. This became the deadliest aviation disaster in history. After this incident, several aviation regulations were changed. From then on, pilots were not allowed to say, "I am ready for takeoff" or "ready for departure." They had to say, "I am ready for pushback," meaning they should not even mention the flight number before getting permission. A new rule was established requiring the pilot, CO pilot, and flight engineer to consult with each other before commencing their flight, ensuring that all 3 were informed so that if there was a problem, at least one of them would understand it, rather than the KLM pilot making decisions on his own. This disaster led to the inclusion of these mistakes in pilot training, teaching them how to communicate not only with CO pilots, but also with the control tower, ensuring that misunderstandings in conversations do not occur. Risk of destruction.